A drone doesn't hunt people. It hunts heat. Elena Vance had 42 minutes before friendly bombers erased the crash site, and everyone's still breathing on it. The radio couldn't cancel the order. A geomagnetic storm had killed the link. Somewhere beyond the steel and the white noise, a thermal drone was already sweeping the valley, blind to the storm and hungry for anything warm. None of that fixed the immediate problem in front of her. A young soldier named Chen turning into a physics equation on the floor of an APC. The APC bucked hard enough to rattle her teeth. Diesel stank in the confined bay, but fresh blood shoved it out of the way, hot iron and rust and panic. Chen lay on his back with his thigh torn open, the femoral pulse fluttering under her palm like a trapped bird. Elena had ditched her gloves without thinking. Bare fingers went slick instantly. Blood wasn't a stream, it was a rhythm, each weak beat, sending a bright, wet surge across her knuckles. She leaned her weight in, pinning the artery against muscle, feeling it throb and then, worse, fade, while her mind kept ticking through numbers, temperature dropping, coagulation failing, acid building, the triad closing like a vice. Her jaw clenched until her molars hurt hypothermia. Coagulopathy. Acidosis. The words came out as a snarl, more reflex than speech. She looked up and saw her aide frozen in place, eyes wide, hands hovering over a bag of O-negative plasma that had started to crystallize along the plastic seams. Tiny ice flecks floated inside like glitter in a snow globe. Elena's hand snapped out and cracked the aide across the cheek, hard. A quick slap that sounded wrong in the metal box. Not cruelty. Urgency with no padding. She grabbed his wrists and shoved the bag against his bare skin, under his armpit, then lower, pressing it into warm flesh like she was trying to melt the Arctic itself. The APC lurched again. Loose gear clanged. A stretcher rail slammed down and rebounded. Elena kept her palm locked on Chen's thigh, watching his lips go grey, watching the blood pool thicken and darken, watching his chest fight for air in short, wet pools, and catching herself listening for the flat line that haunted her, an old, clean beep turning into one long line. She hated that she could almost hear it through the roar. She forced her focus back down into her hand. Pulse. Pressure. Keep it. Keep it. Keep it. Metal screamed. Not a blast of light. Not a blackout. Pure physical violence. The kind that went through bone. The kinetic mine hit like a giant fist under the hull. The APC's weight shifted, treads biting and then skipping, and the rear compartment became a centrifuge. Elena's shoulder slammed into the bulkhead. Her grip broke for half a second. Half a second was an eternity. Her fingers slid off the artery, and the femoral opened like a mouth. Blood erupted. Warm, arterial spray streaked the ceiling and spattered the aide's chest. Elena lunged back in, palm flat, but the floor pitched and her knees slipped. Chen's eyes rolled toward her, not pleading, already distant, as if his body had started leaving before his brain got the memo. The analog alarm began to shriek, a mechanical, teeth-on-edge wail that made her vision narrow. Dead man's switch. Engine failure. Hull breach warnings. All the old sounds that meant the system had decided you were expendable. She forced pressure down again, but the pulse under her hand wasn't fighting anymore. It was a stutter, a hiccup, then nothing. Chen's chest rose once, stopped, and the silence inside him hit harder than the explosion. Elena stared at his throat and waited for the reflex swallow that never came. The long beep she'd feared didn't come from a monitor. It came from inside her head anyway. clean and cruel. The aide made a broken sound and tried to crawl away, dragging the half-thawed plasma bag with him like a child clutching a toy. Elena didn't reach for him, nor for Chen. Instead, she stayed where she was, blood soaking her sleeves, and listened as the APC's dying mechanics screamed around them. The lights dimmed to a sick orange. Smoke drifted low, tasting of burnt oil and hot insulation. Outside the armor, the storm's roar pressed against the hull like a living thing. Then something else cut through it, thin, high, wrong. A high-pitch whine that didn't belong to engines or wind. Elena froze. So did everyone else. A red line slid across the cracked rear hatch seam, a laser threading through the gap like a needle. It swept once, slow, searching. It passed over Chen's body where it lay in the spreading pool, already cooling, already losing its glow. The laser didn't linger. It didn't care. It moved on. It landed on the aide. His skin shone with heat and sweat, panic making him burn hotter than the metal box could hide. The red dot hardened, brightened. The sensor's blink turned into a steady, hungry stare. The aide sucked in a laugh-thruth, and Elena watched his exhale fog the air, warm, visible, betraying. Elena's mind went clinical again, because it had no other safe place to go. Cold bodies disappear. Warm ones get chosen. The drone didn't need eyes. It had a scale and a threshold and a trigger finger made of code. She shifted her bloody hand off Chen's thigh at last. Slow, controlled. Like moving too fast would make the machine outside notice her next. The laser stayed on the aide's chest, pulsing red in the smoke. The hatch finally gave with a grunt and a shoulder slam, and the world outside hit them like shattered glass. -18 Celsius didn't feel like cold. It felt like punishment. Elena crawled out of the APC onto snow that squeaked under her knees. The sound swallowed instantly by the whiteout. Wind drove ice grains into her face. Every exposed patch of skin lit up and then went numb. Behind her, the wreck still breathed heat, smoke curling from vents. Metal, radiating a false, comforting warmth that would get them killed if they stayed near it. Men spilled out after her, stumbling, half-blind, coughing, hands shaking so hard their rifles clacked against armor plates. Someone retched. Someone prayed under their breath and then choked it back like the storm could hear. Elena took one look at the tremors and went straight to triage mode, voice cutting through the roar. She wanted silver survival tarps up, windbreaks, anything to trap a pocket of air and slow the heat loss. The body burned fuel fast in cold like this, and the team was already in deficit. Chen's body stayed inside the APC. There wasn't time to drag the dead into the storm, not when the living were about to start dropping. Her aide, still marked by that red dot in her mind, stood hunched, panting, eyes darting at the sky, like he expected the laser to come back. Elena didn't soothe him. She watched his breath plume and the way warmth escaped in every exhale. The environment was the third enemy, and it didn't negotiate, neither did whatever was humming above the clouds. Commander Nathan Greer barreled into her space like the wind had spat him out. His face was raw from the cold, his mouth cracked, his eyes bloodshot. He coughed hard, deep, wet, restrained, then grabbed a fistful of her jacket and yanked her into the lee of the smoking hull. Not privacy, just a fraction less wind. He shoved a rugged, armoured datapad toward her and held it there with hands that didn't quite stop shaking. The screen glowed harshly in the storm's grey. Big digits. Impossible to ignore. 42 minutes. 0 seconds. The colon blinked like a heartbeat. 41:59. 58. Greer's thumb left smears on the casing where his glove was torn. "Look at it," he rasped. And then he had to cough again, shoulders jerking. The sound was human. The numbers were not. The clock didn't care that they were freezing. It didn't care that Chen had just bled out on a steel floor. It just ate seconds. He leaned close so she could hear him, voice forced through the gale. The order had been locked. Coordinates set. Friendly B, 52 bombers, inbound on a fail-secure path. If the black box core wasn't recovered, Command would flatten the valley with thermobaric fire to bury the mistake. Bury the tech. Bury them. Elena's brain tried to find a loophole and came up empty. VHF was dead in a geomagnetic storm. No comms. No recall. No appeal. Greer's grip tightened for one beat. Not anger, terror dressed as authority. He wasn't a cartoon villain. He was a man staring at a clock that would kill his people either way. "Command locked the coordinates," Greer shouted, voice like gravel until his throat gave up. "If we don't recover the black box data core in 42 minutes, B, 52 bombers will carpet bomb this valley to sanitize it. We have no way back. 42 minutes. No way back." A friendly fire deadline that acted like an execution schedule. Above them, the high-pitch whine returned, thin, razor-edged. Not wind. Not aircraft. Elena's head snapped up. Whiteout hid everything, but the sound moved with intent. Her stomach tightened as if the air itself had turned to ice. The APC's engine block was still hot. A beacon. A flare in infrared. She could almost see it on a thermal feed. A bright, guilty bloom in a field of cold. Men shouted, pointing, but the storm stole the words. Elena saw the aide's breath plume again, bright and obvious. She wanted to clamp a hand over his mouth, but she didn't move. Movement drew attention. Heat drew death. Every decision now had 2 clocks on it, one in the sky and one in Greer's hand, and both were counting down in the same direction. Elena's mind ran the survival math anyway. Shelter buys time. Time buys options. Options buy lives. But the system above had already priced them. 42 minutes wasn't a warning. It was a sentence. The drone didn't fire a bullet. It dropped a block of heat. A sudden, descending hiss cut through the wind, and the world flashed orange. The thermobaric charge hit the APC, and the wreck became a sun. Heat punched outward in a wave that slammed Elena back into the snow. Her eyelashes singed. The shock stole breath from lungs already struggling in the cold. For a split second, the warmth felt like relief. Then the air turned toxic, and the flame rolled up into the storm, feeding on whatever oxygen it could find. The APC was gone as shelter in an instant, metal buckling, ammo cooking off with sharp cracks, smoke thickening into a choking, oily curtain. The men scattered on instinct, crawling, scrambling, boots slipping on ice. Elena forced herself up, blinking through tears that froze at the corners. The contrast was brutal. One side of her face burned from the blast. The other side went numb from wind. Steam rose off her sleeves where blood had soaked through and then flashed cold again. Greer still clutched the datapad like it was scripture. The clock kept blinking. 41 minutes and change now, and dropping. Elena looked at the fireball that had been their ride. Their walls, their last warm pocket in the valley. No cover, no fallback, just white space and the thin scream of machines hunting heat. She didn't waste words on grief. She didn't waste words on blame. She scanned her people, counted bodies, counted tremors, counted breaths, and then looked past the burning wreck into the blank storm where the black box waited like a trap. They were going to walk. They walked because stopping was just dying in place with paperwork attached. 20 minutes of knee-deep snow turned every step into a mechanical failure, hips burning, calves cramping, lungs scraping cold air that felt too sharp to be real. The orange smear of the APC fire vanished behind them, swallowed by the whiteout. Ahead was a grey trough between rock walls, wind funneling straight through like it was trying to sand them down to bone. Elena watched men shrink inside their gear, shoulders hunched, fingers clawing at straps they couldn't feel. A frost built on lashes until faces looked half made of ice. Greer pushed from the rear, coughing into his collar, one hand welded to the rugged datapad. He checked it like it could change its mind. Seconds dropped anyway. The cold didn't care about chain of command. It didn't even care about bravery. It just kept stripping heat off skin, off breath, off the little moral comforts people carried into war and pretended would matter later. The first man went down without drama. One knee sank, then both, and he stayed there, as if the snow finally convinced him to rest. A second soldier sagged a few yards later, mouth already purple at the edges, eyes unfocused. Elena dropped beside them, quick and low, forcing her hands to work even as her own joints stiffened. Pupils, wide, glassy, not reacting. Stage 3 hypothermia. No shivering. That was the part that fooled people. Quiet looked like calm until the heart quit. Greer barreled up, rage and loyalty tangled together. He roared for 4 men to break formation and carry them. It sounded right. It was suicide math. Elena did it anyway. 4 carriers meant half speed. Half speed meant the whole team would still be in the open when the drone grid stitched the valley again. Half speed meant they'd miss the black box window and the bombers would solve the problem for everyone. The would-be carriers hesitated, then grabbed straps and underarms with hands that shook too hard to trust. The downed men didn't help. Their heads lolled. Their lips had gone that bruised blue that wasn't pain anymore, just chemistry. Elena felt the flatline fear crawl up from somewhere old, the memory of a long tone that never ended. She pinned it under numbers. Resource sink. Heat leak. Deadweight with a heartbeat. She pulled on a fresh pair of medical gloves and stretched the latex hard over her fingers. Snap. The sound cut through the wind like a gavel. She checked the pupils one last time, then reached into her pouch and brought out 2 black plastic tags. Light, cheap, unforgiving. She slapped one onto the first man's chest plate, then the second, pressing until the adhesive bit through frost and fabric. Greer snatched the comms handset off the radio operator's harness and shoved it toward her like a weapon. The VHF crackled weakly, half dead in the geomagnetic storm. "I'm logging this," he rasped, coughing hard. He wanted a record to prove she'd crossed the line. Elena took the handset back with one clean motion. No theatre, just ownership. She raised the mic and spoke like she was reading a temperature, eyes never leaving the tags. The red laser arrived before the argument could. It split the drifting snow a few yards away, then swept toward them in a slow, deliberate arc. Not a spotlight. A measurement. Men froze. Breath hitched. The drone's thin whine hung above the wind like a blade being tested. The beam passed over one of the downed soldiers and didn't pause. His heat was already fading into the background. Then it slid toward the cluster of living bodies and lingered, tasting the warmth leaking through collars and seams. Elena didn't wait for Greer to find a sentence that saved his conscience. Captain Elena Vance. Activating Senior Medical Officer Article 109. Tactical command is revoked. If we carry them, we become Foreign Object Debris FOD on this battlefield in 3 minutes. The comms unit clicked as the recorder captured every syllable. Greer's hands flexed on his sling. He didn't raise a weapon. He didn't need to. The environment had already threatened them. The laser's red glint trembled across the snow between the tagged men, like a line nobody could cross. The 4 carriers backed away on instinct, dragging their hands off straps, suddenly grateful for an order that let them stop trying. The tagged soldiers made small sounds, thin, wet, animal noises that didn't form words anymore. Elena didn't answer. She turned into the wind and motioned the formation forward. Greer followed because the log existed now, because the drone existed now, because the clock existed now. Behind them, the snow swallowed the 2 black tags and the last scraps of human heat. The laser swept on, indifferent, and the team marched away from living voices that grew weaker and then vanished. The ravine pinched down until rock pressed on every side. 30 men wedged under a broken ledge in a shallow pocket that wasn't shelter so much as a place to die slower. Bodies packed shoulder to shoulder, plates scraping, helmets knocking, boots grinding ice. The air turned thick with human exhaust. Every breath came back already used, damp and sour, and froze the second it touched skin. Elena felt it on her upper lip, a thin film that hardened into sting. Above them, the whiteout hid the sky, but it didn't hide the grid. 5 drones drifted somewhere overhead, patient and unseen, their high whine sliding in and out as they changed position. Men tried to be quiet. Bodies betrayed them anyway. A cough swallowed too late. A boot shifting, breath pushed through clenched teeth in a quick, panicked puff. Elena watched shoulders rise and fall too fast. Hyperventilation. Heat loss. Oxygen wasted in a pocket where there wasn't much to waste. Greer crouched near the mouth of the pocket, datapad glow painting his face an ugly, sick pale. The countdown kept blinking. Under 20 minutes now. He kept coughing deep, wet. Restrained, then checked the numbers again like staring could stop them. Eleanor could read him the way she read patience. Narrowed options, bad decisions lining up like dominoes. When he brought his rifle up, it was almost gentle. Muscle memory. The one tool he trusted. The barrel rose toward the unseen drones, and Elena moved without thinking. She grabbed the handguard and drove the muzzle down into the rock. It thumped, loud enough that half the men flinched. Greer snapped his head toward her, eyes bright with desperation. He wanted to shoot because shooting felt like control, because leaving 2 men behind had stripped the story off him and he needed it back. Elena leaned in, close, voice low and sharp, not comforting. Physics didn't need comfort. "Don't," she said, then kept it simple because there wasn't time for a speech. A muzzle flash wasn't light out here, it was heat, a burst of 3,000 degrees in a world trying to die cold. On thermal it would bloom like a flare. The drones wouldn't have to search. They'd just snap to it. "If that rifle fires, you make a 3,000-degree beacon," Elena said. "You light this pocket up for every sensor overhead. 1 shot and they drop something in here that burns the air. Stow it." Greer's jaw worked. He hated it. He understood it. He lowered the rifle because he could hear the truth in her tone, and because the sky was already listening. A man behind them started to suck air too fast, panic chewing through oxygen. Elena felt the pocket tighten, not just from bodies, from the idea that they might suffocate here without anyone firing around. She shoved that thought away, one problem at a time. She reached up and yanked a set of night vision goggles off a soldier's helmet. The rubber eye cup was brutally cold, the kind that stung even through skin that had gone half numb. She pressed it into her orbit and felt the edge bite like a seal. Thermal mode flattened the world into false certainty. The open snowfield beyond the ledge should have been empty. It wasn't. A shape lay half buried in drift snow ribs curved under a thin crust, fur stiff as wire. A wolf, dead long enough that its heat had bled into the ground and vanished. On the thermal feed it didn't glow. It didn't register as a body. It was just snow, blank, invisible. Elena lowered the goggles slowly and blinked hard, eyes watering and freezing at the corners. The men watched her face, waiting for luck. There wasn't any. There was a rule. The laser in the APC sliding past Chen's cooling corpse. The drone lingering on sweat and breath. The machine hunted heat. Cold was camouflage. The dead wolf wasn't a symbol. It was a proof of concept lying in the drift. Greer stared at her like he wanted her to say something clean and heroic. Elena didn't give him that. She looked out into the storm and let the idea settle with the weight it deserved. Cold bodies disappeared. If they wanted to live, they were going to have to make themselves into something the drones couldn't see, and the clock didn't care how that felt. Eleanor dumped the medkit onto the snow like she was spilling a deck she'd already memorized. Plastic clattered and skittered across rock. Syringes rolled, clicking together in a sound that felt too loud under the ledge. Greer's datapad glow flashed in her peripheral vision. 18 minutes, 17, and change. The numbers kept falling no matter how badly anyone wanted to argue with them. Above the whiteout, the drones kept orbiting, their high-pitched whine drifting in and out like a thin blade. The men stared at the pile like it was a joke, then like it was a threat. A dead wolf didn't show up on thermal. A dead man didn't get targeted. That was the point, and it landed hard. Elena didn't dress it up. She shoved a syringe into a gloved hand, then another, moving down the line like she was issuing ammo. She could taste metal where the cold had split her gums. Blood in her mouth. Proof of heat. Greer tried to say her name like it was a stop sign. The wind ate half of it. Elena didn't look up. She watched faces instead, lips paling, hands shaking, eyes not tracking. Panic made people warm. Warm got you killed. She snapped fresh gloves onto her hands, snap, then pointed at an arm, and gave the only instruction that mattered. Now. They didn't want to do it. The moment the first man pressed the needle in, the others flinched like they could feel it too. Caps cracked off. More clatter. Someone swore, the word thick around the gauze Elena had already thrown at them. The drug wasn't a miracle. It was a muzzle. Dexmedetomidine shut down the body's automatic furnace, shivering, and the cold got a clean shot at their core. Elena worked while she talked, moving from wrist to wrist, forcing the angle when fingers wouldn't cooperate. The medicine slid in and, minute by minute, tremors dulled. Not comfort. Suppression. Eyes widened when they realized the shaking was stopping. A couple men tried to back out. Elena shoved them back into line with a hard palm to the chest plate and kept moving. Then the obvious problem punched through their fear. Breath. 30 mouths venting warm air into -18. On thermal, it would look like a flare trail. Jet blast, Elena called it, because soldiers understood that kind of danger. One man yanked his wad out to gasp. Fog blooming in the pocket. Elena snatched the gauze back and rammed it at him. "Stuff it full," she barked. "Snow. All the way. Bite down and breathe through it." She demonstrated with her own, jaw tight. The snow tasted clean for half a second, then tasted like her own blood. Fine. Blood was warm. The pocket under the ledge turned into a factory line of self-burial. Men clawed shallow pits with gloved hands, just deep enough to hide a torso. It felt wrong watching trained operators reduce themselves to animals making nests. Dread stayed loud even when nobody could talk with gauze jammed between teeth. Eyes kept flicking upward, as if rock and storm were transparent. Greer grabbed her sleeve and hauled her close. His breath came hard through his own snow-packed gauze, eyes furious, wet, terrified. The datapad clock was already bleeding toward 15. He wanted an answer you could aim. Eleanor shook him off with a short, brutal motion. No gunfire. Not here. She drove her own needle in last. The drug hit like ice water, poured straight into the bloodstream, cold, sliding up her forearm, then a bite in her chest. Her body tried to ignite. The reflex got muzzled. She lay back in the first pit, pulled snow over her abdomen, then her ribs. Pressure settled in. Weight. Compression. Boots shuffled above her, then stopped as men dropped into their own graves. The cold started working the moment the shaking stopped. It didn't negotiate. It just took. Elena kept her eyes open, staring at the underside of the ledge, counting time the only way she trusted by listening to her own heartbeat and the storm's rhythm. 15 minutes. Past that, blood thickened and rhythm failed. She made the price plain, because pretending there was safety was how teams died. Her voice came out, clipped around the gauze, more threat than reassurance. Your breath will light up on FLIR, like jet exhaust, she said. Snow in the gauze, mouth sealed, 15 minutes before your heart quits for real, in the hole. Now. They obeyed because the alternative was fire from above, or a drone-guided strike from the dark. Elena felt the snow settle heavier as bodies stopped moving. Numbness crept in. Fingers first, then wrists, then the bones inside her hands like the marrow was switching off. Somewhere overhead, the whine sharpened, passed above the ledge, then drifted away. Elena didn't move. Movement made heat. Heat made death. Darkness wasn't an absence under the snow. It was a weight. Elena lay on her back with a thin roof of packed drift pressing down on her chest, just enough to make every inhale feel like lifting a plate. The world narrowed to muffled wind above, and the taste of gauze in her mouth, snow melted into slush, then refroze at the corners of her lips. Her tongue felt like it belonged to someone else. She couldn't swallow without thinking about it, and she couldn't think too hard without wasting heat. The drug in her vein kept moving anyway. She could feel it as a cold line under skin. The sensation not so much pain as violation, ice sliding toward the heart, touching it, then spreading. The body tried to answer with shivering. The reflex twitched, searched for purchase, and found nothing. Dexmedetomidine was a quiet chokehold. The furnace door stayed shut. Without the shaking, the cold got to do its job cleanly. Eleanor held her eyes open in the dark, not for comfort, just to stay awake, because sleep wasn't rest here. Sleep was the body deciding the argument was over. Blood abandoned her hands first. It wasn't dramatic. It was a retreat. Capillaries in her fingers squeezed down until sensation thinned to pins, then to nothing. Her fingertips stopped existing. The numbness crawled past the knuckles, into the joints, and she knew clinically, without romance, this was where tissue started losing votes. Frostbite wasn't a monster. It was a math problem that ended with amputation. Her heart did what hearts do when they're being dragged toward hypothermia. It slowed. 90 in the chaos earlier. 60 as the drug settled and the snow stole heat. 40 as her core temperature slid toward 32. The beats didn't come in a reassuring rhythm anymore. They came with gaps, space between them long enough for the mind to start inventing endings. She listened for the flat line she hated, that long, clean tone that haunted her like a phantom monitor. The fear didn't show up as tears. It showed up as counting. She reached for her stethoscope and found it by feel, the tube stiffening in the cold. Her jaw ached from clenching gauze. She shifted the earpieces into place under her helmet straps with hands that barely obeyed, then pressed the chest piece against her own sternum and waited for the sound to prove she still had one job: stay alive long enough to keep everyone else alive. The heartbeat in the stethoscope wasn't the confident thump of a healthy body. It was a damp, distant knock, like someone tapping from the other side of a wall. Thud, pause, thud. Elena couldn't trust her fingers to count anymore, so she did the one ugly thing that always worked. She bit down on the rubber tube with teeth that were going numb, anchoring it in place, and counted the gaps with her mind. 1, 2, 3, thud. She wanted to move, to flex, to generate heat, to reassure herself she still owned her limbs. She didn't. Movement made warmth. Warmth made a target. She held still and let the snow press her into the ground. The storm's hiss above became a constant, and within that constant, she searched for the drone's whine. Sometimes it was there, faint and sharp, and it made her stomach tighten, even though her stomach was mostly numb too. Sometimes it wasn't, and the silence was worse because the mind filled it with the sound anyway. Her breath stayed trapped behind the gauze. Inhale through snow, exhale through snow. The air tasted like iron and clean cold. The plumes that would have betrayed them on FLIR got strangled in her mouth, chilled before they could escape. She felt the urge to cough dry, useless, and strangled it down. Coughing was heat. Panic was heat. Talking was heat. Everything human was heat. The pressure on her chest stayed steady. The darkness stayed absolute. Time didn't jump. It crawled. The worst part wasn't pain. Pain would have been information. The worst part was the creeping sense of detachment, like her body was becoming a set of numbers someone else was tracking. 32 Celsius. 31 point something. A core drifting toward a place where enzymes quit and blood thickened. She imagined viscosity changing. Imagined red cells moving slower. Imagined the heart squeezing against thicker fluid and getting tired. Thud, pause, thud. She knew what the drone would see if it looked down. Almost nothing. A field of cold. 30 bodies fading toward the same temperature as the world around them. Heat erased by physics and fear. It wasn't victory. It was disguise. It was turning living people into something the machine couldn't measure. Elena let the cold finish tightening its grip, and the last clean thought she held onto was simple and ugly. If her heart missed one beat too many, nobody would pull her back in time. The first thing Elena heard was the whine change pitch, like someone tightening a wire in the dark. It cut across the storm and then settled right over them, close enough that the snow roof seemed to buzz. She lay flat, cheek pressed into gritty ice, gauze packed in her mouth so hard her jaw ached. Air moved through the snow in the gauze with a wet, muffled rasp. In, out, slow. The stethoscope tube stayed between her teeth like a bit, anchoring her to the only sound she trusted. The red laser arrived as a thin line that brightened the snow from above. It didn't splash like light. It sliced. A clean bar of colour sliding over drifting crystals, making each flake look sharp for a split second before it vanished again. Elena didn't blink. Blinking was nothing, but the body treated it as something. A tiny motion, a tiny heat spike. Her mind kept repeating the same sentence. Stillness is camouflage. The drone passed so close the pressure of its rotors seemed to compress the air. Not a helicopter thump, a high-pitched whine that felt like a razor on glass. Someone above her shifted a fraction in his shallow grave, and the snow creaked. Elena felt it through her ribs. She wanted to shove a hand up and hold him down like a parent quieting a child. She couldn't. Hands didn't work. Hands didn't exist. To her left, the soldier who dug in beside her started to tremble. It began as a small vibration in the snow, the kind you could blame on wind. Then it became a mechanical shudder, shoulder to hip, as if his muscles had decided to argue with the drug and lost. Elena sensed it more than saw it, a ripple through their shared cover. The stupid, human refusal to lie still and freeze. His gauze slipped. She heard it before she saw it, a soft, wet pop as snow-packed fabric came loose from teeth. The man tried to clamp down again, panicked, but his jaw didn't obey. A warm exhale escaped. In this cold, it should have been invisible to the eye. It wasn't invisible to a machine. The breath plume rose through the thin crust of snow like smoke through a burned floor. Jet blast. Elena's brain supplied the term with ugly calm. On FLIR, it would flare white-hot for a second, a perfect little arrow pointing down. She kept her own breath trapped behind the gauze and watched the world narrow to that one mistake. Above, the drone stuttered in place. The whine hiccuped. Not moving forward anymore. Hovering. The laser stopped sweeping and snapped onto the plume's origin point as if it had been yanked by a hook. A red dot hardened, then pulsed, then held steady. Elena couldn't see the drone itself, but she could feel its attention settle like weight. Target fixation, she thought. The phrase came from somewhere clinical, somewhere she'd learned that some systems locked onto a single stimulus and forgot the rest of the picture. A programming flaw, a glitch that might buy them seconds or might get them all killed. The drone didn't immediately drop a charge. It hovered, analyzing, trying to decide if the heat it saw was a target worth spending a bomb on. The soldier beside her made a thin sound. Not words, his mouth was empty now, his breath uncontrolled. Another warm puff leaked out. Elena's stomach tightened. She tasted blood where the cold had split her gums, metallic and warm, and she hated it because warmth was betrayal. She wanted to close his mouth with her hand. She wanted to jam the gauze back in. She wanted to do her job. Combat medic. Fix the failure. Instead, she lay there like a corpse and watched a living man become a beacon. The laser jittered, then steadied again. A tiny red flicker appeared in the corner of her vision as the drone's indicator light flashed through the snow. Blink! Blink! Elena counted it like heartbeats. Each blink was a question the machine was asking. Is it real? Is it worth it? Is there more? She answered in her head because her mouth was full of snow. No, not worth it. Not enough. Go away. The soldier beside her stopped shivering for a heartbeat, then spasmed again, bigger. His breath plume puffed once more. The drone's whine rose, then dipped, like it was adjusting altitude by inches. Elena felt the snow roof flex. If it descended, if it fired, the pocket would become a furnace. Oxygen would ignite. They'd die without ever standing up. She held still anyway. She held her eyes open until they burned from cold. In the end, the drone didn't decide. It hovered, fixated, chewing on its own inputs, and then drifted on, laser sliding away like a blade being sheathed. The red line moved past Elena's face, past the soldier's trembling shoulder, and disappeared into the white. The soldier kept breathing, loud and warm, and Elena didn't move to stop him. She couldn't. The team's survival was balanced on a rule colder than ethics. One motion could make 30 targets. The snow roof cracked like thin lake ice, one sharp snap, then a crumble. Elena shoved an elbow up and it barely moved. Her arm felt like wood wrapped in cloth. She drove again, harder, and the crust broke. Granules spilled into her face. Cold air hit her eyes like sand. She dragged herself out of the shallow grave, and the world tipped bright and blank. The wind, loud enough to drown thought. Her hands rose on instinct. The sight stopped her, fingertips dark, purple-black under the nails, skin tight and shiny. Wrong. She tried to flex and got nothing. Frostbite wasn't pain yet. It was absence. Then a distant scream her brain couldn't locate. Fine motor control was gone. She could still think, though, and thinking told her the 15 minutes were over. If she didn't restart the furnace now, blood would thicken and stop moving. Around her, the snow mound stayed still, 30 shallow graves, 30 bodies balanced on the edge. Elena crawled because standing felt like a fall waiting to happen. She dug into her kit with wrists that didn't belong to her anymore until plastic clicked. Epinephrine. She tried to grip the auto-injector. Her fingers didn't close. It slid, bounced once, and disappeared into powder like the snow was swallowing it on purpose. She went down to her face and started searching like an animal. Hands were useless, so she used the flats of her wrists, sweeping snow aside, feeling nothing and seeing everything. The white cylinder flashed. She pinned it against her thigh with one forearm. The cap needed a twist. She couldn't twist, so she trapped it in her teeth and bit down hard, jaw clamping until her molars ached. She jerked her head. The cap popped free. Elena braced the injector along the meat of her leg and shoved. Not a clean, practiced motion. A violent press through fabric into muscle. The spring fired, a blunt punch of pressure. Then the burn arrived, fast and mean, like someone poured fire into a frozen limb. Her vision tunneled, then snapped wider. Her heart rate surged, angry, trying to make up for lost time. Pain finally showed up in her hands like a delayed bill, bright enough to make her nauseous. She welcomed it, Pain meant blood was moving. She didn't stand up and feel heroic. She staggered on her knees, grabbed the next injector with her forearms, and crawled to the nearest mound. She tore snow away with her wrists, ripping crust, exposing a helmet, then a face blue at the lips, and jammed the injector into his thigh and fired it, holding it there with both wrists because her fingers wouldn't obey. His chest jerked. A gasp tried to form behind the snow-packed gauze. One down. She moved mound to mound, digging and stabbing and moving ugly work, repetitive work, the kind that saved people. Greer's grave sat closer to the ledge. Elena found him by the coffee tried to swallow, a wet bark leaking through frozen gauze. His eyes were open when she yanked him free, furious, terrified, too slow. He tried to speak. Nothing but a choke. Elena pinned the injector to his leg and fired it. Greer jolted. He ripped the gauze out to gulp air, and Elena shoved it back in with the heel of her wrist before a warm plume could bloom. He glared at her like she'd slapped him. She didn't care. Warmth was still a target. Some men woke with a shudder and a wild look, like they'd been yanked back from a place they almost accepted. Some stayed slack, and Elena stayed on them longer, rubbing sternums with numb wrists, counting breaths, listening for any sign the heart had decided to keep working. When she reached the soldier who'd trembled beside her, the mound felt wrong, denser, harder. Elena tore it open anyway. A face emerged, wax pale, lashes rimed white, mouth open. No gauze, no breath. The skin around his lips had turned that grey-blue that wasn't cold anymore. It was finished. His pupils were blown wide, black discs that didn't care about light. Eleanor pressed her stethoscope to his chest and heard nothing. No damp knock, no distant thud. Just the storm and her own breathing trapped behind snow. She started compressions because not starting would be an admission. Her hands couldn't form a proper seal, so she used the heels of her wrists, stacking them awkwardly on his sternum and driving down with body weight. The chest didn't give the way living chests gave. It was stiff, resisting like wood. Elena pumped anyway. 1, 2, 3. Air didn't move. Blood didn't move. The man didn't change. Elena stopped. Not slowly. Not with words. She stopped because the next mound still needed her, and the clock still didn't care. She stuffed fresh snow into her own gauze, bit down, and crawled back into the work. Behind her, Greer coughed once raw and alive. Around her, men staggered upright in the storm, shaking and swearing and clinging to each other. Elena looked at her blackened hands and felt the burn climbing into her wrists. She filed it under later. Pain was paperwork. Survival was now. They'd bought their invisibility with one heartbeat they couldn't get back. Every joint screamed as motion came back, hinges thawing under brute force, and nausea rose with each step, as if the epinephrine was still burning in her veins. They moved like the storm had wrung the muscle out of them and left the wiring. 29 men, half awake and half dead, staggered across open snow with their heat still muted, their breaths still forced through snow-packed gauze when they remembered. The valley looked bigger now that the drones had drifted off, bigger and emptier. The whiteout thinned in patches, and through those thin spots Elena could see the black shape ahead, an aircraft that didn't look like an aircraft anymore. Just a broken wedge of stealth skin and ripped ribs half buried in drift, the kind of wreck that should have been erased already. Greer kept the data pad angled against his chest, like it was fragile glass. He checked it, swallowed, checked it again. The digits didn't blink like a heart anymore. They blinked like a fuse. He mouthed numbers without sound. 10 seconds. 9. His cough came up anyway, rough and wet, and he bit it down hard enough to make his jaw jump. Elena watched his hands shake. Not fear, aftershock. Cold and adrenaline burning through a body that had been forced into a slow, near-dead rhythm and dragged back out. Eleanor's own hands hung in front of her like someone else's property. Bandless, glove torn, fingertips darkened, joints stiff. She flexed and got a delayed answer pain, like a match struck under ice. She filed it away because everything had to be filed away until there was time to fall apart. The only thing she let herself track was whether the men behind her were still upright. One tripped, went to a knee, forced himself back up. Another leaned on a buddy, then shoved him away, stubborn about not being carried. Nobody spoke. Sound felt expensive. Every breath was already work. The aircraft's belly hatch was sealed under a layer of rime. A thick, reinforced pane covered the compartment like a shield. Greer didn't bother looking for a clean release. He brought his fist down, and the first strike landed with a dull, stupid thud, like hitting a frozen windshield. The second strike cracked it. The third spiderwebbed the glass, and blood smeared across the webbing, dark and slow. His knuckles were already raw. He didn't care. He slammed again, then hooked his fingers into the fracture and ripped. The pane gave with a sharp report, shards popping loose and skittering over snow. Greer jammed his arm into the opening, shoulder grinding against edges, and fumbled inside the cavity like he was reaching into a corpse. The datapad beeped once some final warning tone, and then went silent as the last seconds died. Greer found the core by feel, yanked it out, and for a second it looked small enough to be nothing. A black box the size of a thick paperback, ice clinging to it, a faint indicator light still alive. Eleanor saw the tiny module attached to it ping hardware, the thing that told the world where to burn. Greer's face tightened. He didn't say a prayer. He lifted his rifle by the grip and brought the butt down like a hammer. Metal crunched. Not a heroic sound, just cheap defeat. The first blow dented the module casing. The second split it. The third turned it into bent parts and dead wiring. A thin, bright spark flashed and vanished. The indicator light winked out. Greer tossed the ruined module aside, and it disappeared into snow like it had never mattered. He stared at the dead box in his hands, chest heaving, and then the words came out in a shredded breath, almost disbelief. Signals cut. The flying fortress turned around. We're alive, Doctor. The valley didn't answer with fireworks. It answered with the storm easing, just slightly, like the world had gotten bored. The geomagnetic hiss that had murdered their radio began to thin. Eleanor heard it in the background of everything, a static pressure lifting. Then another sound arrived, low and heavy at first, then growing rotor blades biting air. A rescue helicopter. Not salvation, exactly. Just extraction. Men sagged where they stood. Knees hit snow. One guy laughed once, a dry bark, then immediately looked ashamed of it and turned it into a cough. Another sat down hard and didn't try to get back up. Eleanor watched bodies fold like the strings had been cut. The system pressure was gone for a breath, and the bodies took the chance to quit. Elena tried to take one more step, and her ankles buckled. She caught herself on a drift and ended up on her side, cheek in snow, the taste of iron still in her mouth. Her hands curled on instinct, and the curl stopped halfway because tendons didn't want to play. The blackened fingertips looked obscene against white. She stared at them and felt nothing for a second, then felt everything at once, a delayed burn climbing into her wrists. The helicopter's spotlight swept the valley in slow arcs. It caught Greer standing over the wreck, the black box clutched against his chest like a relic. It caught men kneeling in the open. It caught Elena half buried in snow, breathing through gauze out of habit. No one cheered. No one raised a fist. They just waited to be collected, empty and alive. Above them, the rotor wash threw snow into the air and erased their footprints. The storm reclaimed the path like it wanted to pretend they'd never been there. 48 hours later, the cold didn't come from wind. It came from fluorescent lights and white walls that refused to cast a shadow. The room hummed ballast buzz and ventilation whisper, and it made Elena think of lying under snow, listening for a drone, except this sound belonged to a building that would still be here after she wasn't. She sat in a metal chair bolted to the floor, shoulders square, back straight because slouching felt like giving the room permission. Her hands rested on the table, wrapped in bright white bandages that looked clean until you noticed the geometry. shortened fingers, missing segments, the edges where skin met gauze and stopped. The air smelled like antiseptic and cheap coffee. No diesel, no snow. The JAG officer set a file down with the flat, careful motion of someone placing evidence. The folder was thick. Tabs, red stickers, a stamp that said the incident was under legal hold, as if that could keep the valley from repeating itself. He didn't bother with theatre. His uniform was pressed. His face was tired in a way that wasn't sympathetic. It was procedural. He read charges without raising his voice. Off-label drug use under combat conditions, induced hypothermia with predictable risk, the issuance of black tags on living soldiers, a medical override that stripped tactical authority in the field. He said names like they were line items. Elena listened the way she'd listened to heart tones under snow, waiting for the rhythm to change, waiting for the first long beep that meant done. Greer stood in the corner, close enough to be present and far enough to be useless. His cough still lived in him, softer now but stubborn. He kept his hands behind his back as if touching anything in this room would leave prints he couldn't scrub. Elena didn't look at him. If she looked, she'd see the seconds on the datapad. She'd see the instant he smashed the ping module and trusted her. Memory tightened the throat. Memory made heat. She kept her gaze on the table's scratched surface and let the bandages speak for her. The recorder sat between them. A small black box with a red light. The JAG officer tapped it once with a knuckle. A dry click. The light went dark. He leaned forward just enough that Elena could smell mint under disinfectant. For a moment his voice changed. Not warmer, just human. You saved 29 people, Captain. But if the system tolerates this, tomorrow some panicked lieutenant freezes his whole squad to death and calls it medicine. You're a precedent risk. He sat back and pressed the button again. Click. The red light returned. His voice returned with it, flattened into policy. He read the outcome like discharge instructions. Her field medical license revoked, effective immediately. No more combat clearance. No more triage authority on the line. Administrative reassignment pending. The words hit with a dull weight, not shock. Elena didn't argue. Arguing was for people who still believed the system could be persuaded by righteousness. She'd seen what it did to bodies. It protected itself first. The JAG officer slid the file an inch closer, like an offering that wasn't one. Elena saw a space for acknowledged. Her bandaged fingers twitched. The phantom itch, where fingers used to be crawled up her forearms. She nodded once, because nodding cost less than anything else. Greer made a small sound in the corner. Not a protest, more like a breath that hit a wall. The JAG officer didn't look at him. When the meeting ended, a guard opened the door, and the hallway brightness spilled in, harsher than any snowfield. Elena walked out on stiff legs, pain flashing up her arms when the bandages shifted. The corridor smelled like bleach and warmed plastic. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped steady and small bip, bip, bip. So ordinary it almost hurt. She followed it past curtains and beds until she saw them. Men from the valley, patched and altered. A wheelchair with a blanket over a stump. A crutch leaned against a bed. Toes gone. Fingers gone. Faces still scabbed with cold burn. They looked up when she passed, and nothing dramatic happened. No clapping. No speeches. One man tried to stand and failed, then tried again, jaw clenched, and made it halfway. Another straightened in his chair, shoulders back, eyes steady. One by one they raised what they had hands, forearms, the edge of a bandaged stump, and gave her a slow, silent salute. Not relief, not forgiveness, just recognition from men who knew what the valley demanded. Elena didn't return it with her hands. She couldn't. She held their eyes instead, let the beep of the monitor fill the space, and kept walking with the sound following like proof that something she'd done still pulsed in the world.